I'm talking about the hunt for the true identity of D.B. Cooper.
Unknown. It's the most infamous unsolved mystery in American history. A man hijacked a plane, parachuted into the night with $200,000 in cash, and vanished without a trace. For decades, the world has asked, who was D.B. Cooper? Now, after 54 years of speculation, investigators claim the truth has finally been uncovered. And the real identity of D.B. Cooper is more shocking than anyone imagined. On November 24, 1971, a man boarded a Northwest Orient Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. Mid-flight, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming he had a bomb, demanded cash and parachutes, and later leapt from the plane into the stormy Pacific Northwest night. He was never seen again. For decades, the legend of D.B. Cooper has fascinated amateur sleuths, journalists, and even the FBI. Countless suspects were investigated, endless theories debated, and still the case remained unsolved. But recent breakthroughs, from new forensic evidence to re-examined witness accounts, have led many to believe the mystery is finally over. Today, we're diving into the unbelievable story of D.B. Cooper. The hijacking, the investigation, the suspects, and the shocking revelations that point to his true identity. It was the day before Thanksgiving, November 24, 1971, when an ordinary-looking man in a business suit and tie boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland. He paid cash for his ticket under the name Dan Cooper and quietly took his seat near the back of the plane. To the flight attendants, he seemed calm and polite, ordering a bourbon and soda as the flight prepared for takeoff. But shortly after takeoff, everything changed. Cooper handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. At first, she assumed it was just another passenger slipping her a phone number until he leaned closer and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The note contained a chilling demand: $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. If his instructions weren't followed, he threatened to detonate the device in his briefcase. As word spread among the crew, panic set in. Yet witnesses later described Cooper as calm, even courteous, throughout the ordeal. It was a hijacking unlike any other, and it would soon turn into one of the greatest mysteries of all time. But the hijacking itself was just the beginning. The real question was, how did he vanish so completely? Once the plane landed in Seattle, the FBI scrambled to meet Cooper's demands. They delivered the ransom, $200,000 in marked bills, along with the parachutes he requested. In exchange, Cooper released the 36 passengers on board, but he kept the crew. His next instructions shocked everyone. The plane was to take off again, this time headed toward Mexico City. But Cooper had no intention of making it that far. Somewhere over the dense forests of Washington, in the middle of a stormy night, he strapped on a parachute, tied the ransom to his body, and jumped out of the plane at 10,000 feet. No one saw him land. No body was ever found. No trace of the money appeared, at least not right away. The hijacking was over, but the legend was only beginning. D.B. Cooper had pulled off the impossible, escaping the FBI, vanishing into the wilderness, and leaving behind nothing but questions. The world wanted to know, who was this man, and how could he disappear so completely? In the days following the hijacking, the FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Hundreds of agents scoured the forests of Washington and Oregon, searching for any trace of Cooper. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dogs combed the woods, and locals were questioned relentlessly. But despite the massive effort, no parachute, no clothing, and no body were found. The FBI's working theory was simple. Cooper had likely not survived the jump. The weather was terrible, the terrain unforgiving, and the clothing Cooper wore was hardly suited for survival in the freezing November wilderness. But if Cooper hadn't survived, where was his body? Where was the money? As the years went on, the FBI interviewed thousands of potential suspects: veterans, pilots, criminals, even regular citizens who fit the profile. Each time, the trail went cold. The hijacker seemed to have vanished into thin air. And then, in 1980, a shocking discovery reignited the mystery. A young boy camping with his family along the Columbia River unearthed a bundle of deteriorated cash buried in the sand. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to Cooper. It was the first physical evidence connected to the hijacking, but it raised more questions than answers. Had Cooper buried the money himself? Had it washed downstream? And most importantly, if some of the cash was found, where was the rest of it? The FBI was no closer to solving the mystery, but the world's fascination with D.B. Cooper only grew stronger. And while the investigation stalled, the suspects began piling up. Some seemed promising. Others were wild stretches, but all of them kept the legend alive. Over the years, dozens of suspects emerged, each with compelling and sometimes bizarre connections to the case. One of the most notorious was Richard Floyd McCoy, a former Army veteran and skydiver who hijacked a plane just months after Cooper, using an almost identical method. He was later caught and killed in a prison escape, leading some to believe he was the real Cooper, but the FBI officially ruled him out. Another popular suspect was Dwayne Weber, a man who allegedly confessed to his wife on his deathbed that he was D.B. Cooper. She later recalled that he had nightmares about leaving fingerprints on the plane, and handwriting experts even noted similarities between his writing and Cooper's note. Still, the evidence wasn't strong enough to confirm it. Then there was Kenneth Christensen, a former Northwest Orient Airlines employee. He had the right background, knowledge of the airline, and lived a modest life despite having unexplained amounts of money after 1971. Yet again, investigators couldn't pin it down. Every suspect seemed to bring the case closer to being solved, but each time it slipped through the cracks. Cooper remained a ghost, a man with no past and no future, just a legend frozen in time. But decades later, new breakthroughs would breathe life back into the case, discoveries that pointed to a shocking conclusion. By the early 2000s, the D.B. Cooper case had grown cold. The FBI had officially classified it as unsolved, but new technology gave hope that modern science might succeed where decades of old-fashioned detective work had failed. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from DNA. Agents had carefully preserved Cooper's tie, which he had left behind on the plane. Using advancements in forensic testing, investigators were able to extract tiny traces of DNA. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to produce a definitive match to any suspect, but it offered a tantalizing new direction. Then came a shocking twist. Citizen sleuths, independent researchers who had obsessed over the case for years, began analyzing the tie under powerful microscopes. They discovered particles of titanium and rare metals embedded in the fabric. These weren't random. At the time of the hijacking, only a handful of industries dealt with such materials: aerospace, engineering, and high-level manufacturing. This suggested that Cooper may have worked in one of those industries, giving him knowledge of aircraft, parachutes, and perhaps even insider access to airline procedures. Suddenly, the image of Cooper wasn't just of a daring criminal, it was of a man with professional training. The discovery reignited public obsession. If Cooper really had an aerospace background, who fit the profile? The list of suspects grew shorter and sharper. And then, new revelations from eyewitnesses, overlooked for decades, began to surface. In the chaos of the hijacking, several crew members had gotten close looks at Cooper. For years, their descriptions had been the foundation of the FBI's composite sketch: a middle-aged man, around 6 feet tall, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses. But when investigators revisited those accounts, subtle details emerged that hinted at a more specific profile. Florence Schaffner, The flight attendant who received Cooper's note recalled his calm, almost professional demeanor. He wasn't panicked, sloppy, or reckless. He was polite, even reassuring, telling the crew he didn't want to hurt anyone. This wasn't the behavior of an amateur criminal. It was someone who seemed trained, perhaps even disciplined. Another crew member remembered his vocabulary. Cooper used precise aviation terminology, suggesting he had knowledge of planes far beyond that of an ordinary passenger. That detail, overlooked at the time, suddenly carried weight when paired with the titanium particles found on his tie. It painted a new picture. Cooper wasn't a random thrill seeker. He was deliberate, professional, and very likely connected to an industry that gave him both the skills and the confidence to pull off such a daring escape. The question then became, which suspect matched both the science and the psychology? After decades of dead ends, one name began rising above the rest: Robert Rackstraw. Rackstraw was a former Army paratrooper, pilot, and explosives expert with ties to covert military operations. On paper, he matched nearly every requirement. He knew how to parachute from an aircraft, he had training in survival, and his career in aviation gave him insider knowledge. Even his appearance bore a striking resemblance to the FBI sketch of Cooper. When journalists and investigators began digging into Rackstraw's past, the coincidences piled up. He had a reputation for being daring, sometimes reckless, and had been involved in fraud schemes and identity cons. To many, he looked like the perfect candidate, a man with the ability, motive, and nerve to pull off the hijacking. But what made Rackstraw especially compelling was his response to being confronted. When questioned about the Cooper case, he neither fully denied nor admitted involvement. Instead, he dropped cryptic hints, once telling a reporter, "Could have been me." For investigators, that statement was as good as a confession, though not enough for a conviction. Rackstraw lived until 2019, when he passed away at the age of 75. To this day, some believe he was indeed D.B. Cooper, while others argue the evidence is still circumstantial. But just as Rackstraw seemed like the answer, another suspect emerged whose story was equally compelling, and whose ties to the case shocked even seasoned investigators. While Rackstraw dominated headlines, another name began to surface: William Gossett, a military veteran with experience in survival training and parachuting. Gossett reportedly told close friends and family that he was Cooper, describing details of the hijacking that only the perpetrator could have known. Even more suspicious, after the hijacking, Gossett's life seemed to shift. He moved frequently, often taking on new identities and trying to stay under the radar. Friends described him as a man haunted by secrets, someone who carried guilt but never fully unburdened himself. Some researchers became convinced that Gossett, not Rackstraw, was the real Cooper. His military background fit the profile, and his confessions, though unverified, seemed too specific to ignore. The debate between Rackstraw and Gossett divided Cooper sleuths. Was Cooper a confident trickster who relished in taunting investigators, or was he a haunted veteran carrying a heavy burden? The truth, it seemed, was hiding in plain sight, and new forensic breakthroughs were about to push the case closer to a final answer. By the 2010s, the case of D.B. Cooper had become less of a manhunt and more of a forensic mystery. The FBI officially closed its active investigation in 2016, but citizen sleuths, journalists, and retired agents refused to let the legend die. Their persistence uncovered pieces that, when assembled, painted a picture clearer than ever before. The most compelling came from forensic linguistics. Experts compared the wording of Cooper's demands with known writings from suspects. Phrases, idioms, and patterns lined up strikingly with Robert Rackstraw. To many, it was the closest thing to a signature, hidden not in fingerprints, but in the way Cooper used words. Then there was the money. The bundle found in 1980 had baffled investigators for decades, but new sediment testing suggested it hadn't been buried by Cooper at all. Instead, it likely washed downstream from where he landed, consistent with theories that he survived the jump but lost part of the ransom during his escape. Finally, DNA remained the lingering puzzle. Though not conclusive, the partial profile lifted from Cooper's tie excluded many suspects, but did not rule out Rackstraw. Combined with his background, behavior, and cryptic comments, it pushed the scales further in his direction. Still, the debate rages. Was it Rackstraw? Was it Gossett? Or was the real Cooper someone who managed to slip away without leaving a single trace? What remains undeniable is this: Cooper's plan worked. He hijacked a plane, collected his ransom, vanished into history, and left behind a mystery that even today feels like it may never fully be solved. More than half a century later, the name D.B. Cooper still carries weight. He has been immortalized in books, documentaries, and pop culture, symbolizing both daring rebellion and the enduring power of mystery. For some, he was a criminal who endangered lives. For others, he became a folk hero, the man who outwitted the FBI and walked away free. The truth about Cooper's identity may now be closer than ever, but part of the allure is that it was never fully confirmed. Whether it was Robert Rackstraw, William Gossett, or someone whose name we may never know, Cooper represents something larger than one man. He represents the last great outlaw, a figure who dared to challenge authority and disappeared into legend. What makes the story so compelling is not just the crime, but the silence that followed. No confirmed sightings, no definitive evidence, just questions, and the thrill of not knowing for sure. And maybe that's why we're still talking about him today. Because in an age where every mystery is solved by technology and surveillance, D.B. Cooper remains untouchable. So, what do you think? Was the case finally cracked? Or does the true D.B. Cooper remain out there, hidden in history? Share your theories in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories that keep the world guessing. Because sometimes, the greatest treasure isn't gold or ransom money. It's the mystery that refuses to die.